It's kind of difficult today to really imagine, but back in 1975, 76, 77, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was at the forefront of the films that were considered dangerous by Americans in the critical circle. Even among fans of the horror genre, the film was sort of taboo. It was one of those things, whereas you might have seen it, you might have gone to see it, but the legend of the film overshadowed the film itself in many ways. That's not to say that it wasn't a brilliant milestone in cinema, but the marketing and the reputation played a large role in making it the film we know today. By the 1980s, there had been an explosion in franchised horror. The Friday the 13th films had created an unending appetite among the major studios to have their piece of the horror pie. And for a lot of the smaller players, finding an older title that they had the rights to, or could get the rights to at a reasonable rate, became a sweepstakes of a sort. So when Cannon got the rights to make a Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, and brought on board Tobe Hooper, the original film's director, it seemed like a perfect match. Here was a chance to make that big sequel that had instant awareness and could really clean up at the box office. Just one problem. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre works as a self-contained story because it is an allegory for its time. It perfectly reflected Watergate and Vietnam, the social changes on the ground. How would that translate into mid-80s? And to be sure, this wasn't like the Halloween sequels, whereas you could basically just repeat the formula of the first film and have it work. Texas Chainsaw Massacre did not create a legion of imitators, not directly anyway. Certainly its aesthetic was never even attempted by any other films until much, much later when the film had achieved a cult status. So what was Hooper's solution to the problem of how to make a sequel to a film that seems to best exist in its very specific time? The answer was to update his thematics, and also the look and feel of the film to reflect the 1980s. Just like today, there was a rampant pro-liberal attitude throughout Hollywood and in entertainment in general. The Reagan years were a direct affront to the generation that grew up with transitional values between the 1940s and the 1980s. It was a time when the average American had embraced consumerism as their version of what American democracy really looked like. It wasn't simply capitalism. It was integrated into the culture. And that was something that the activists of the 60s and 70s couldn't quite square with their worldview. So, of course, that became a ripe subject to take on in a film about a cannibalistic, homicidal family. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2 makes a lot of the Sawyer family being a small business, a small family business. They make barbecue, they win competitions, they live in the remains of an amusement park. There's a statement being made about the degradation of America from the high point of the 50s optimism for a place like Disneyland to the decayed ruins, now subterranean, that the Sawyer family lives in. It's littered with bodies. The bodies are, yes, they're victims, but they're also victims of a culture that no longer identifies with those high-minded values of the 60s and 70s. Stretch, the DJ, represents a new kind of counterculture, but also kind of a safe counterculture of the 80s. She yearns to do something more serious than play headbanging music for college degenerates who go out drinking and shooting up stop signs. But there's not really room for her in the landscape because the kind of honesty she wants to present is not allowed. These are the safe, confined 1980s. The world where the MPAA was slapping X ratings on films for bullet hits to the head. It was a conservative time, and Stretch is looking to do something real. Something that today wouldn't be at all out of place on, say, Vice. But at the time, there was too many social roadblocks. So when she plays the tape of the murder from the beginning of the film, live and on the air, she immediately has a culture snap back on her. The result is that business, that is, the 80s culture, is threatened by that kind of honesty. And they come to get her, to shut her down. The film features more than just Leatherface, who now is wearing the face of the consumer, the ultimate consumer. It also features Chop Top, a fan favorite. Introduced without really being introduced, he also serves strangely as a character with meta influences. He breaks the fourth wall in very subtle ways, such as when he introduces Leatherface at the radio station by saying, "What do you keep in the vaults? Some of the golden oldies?" Drayton Sawyer spends the bulk of the runtime complaining about the social pressures on the small business. He faces competitions from the big boys. In fact, when Lefty shows up to shut them down, his initial impression is that it's really that the big business, big chili, if you will, have come to shut him down. The same impulse he had when he sent the brothers to take down Stretch. So the film is ultimately about a culture war happening silently in America at a time of peace, relative tranquility, and relative wealth. The film seems to suggest that there's a Faustian deal for that kind of success, and that we give up a core portion of who we are, which is, not coincidentally, the family. Unlike the first film, the only family on screen is the cannibalistic family. Everyone else is individual characters who weave in and out of the story. In fact, you'll notice that Stretch absolutely refuses to get close to any characters during the film. She's a loner. Lefty is a loner. That's the landscape. A bunch of individuals, no longer a real society. And what remains of the family is this distorted looking glass, hopelessly tainted by consumerism. Now, this film is not truly a classic. It's a sort of fan favorite, to be sure, and it's a great film on its own exploitation levels, but it is unfocused, and its message doesn't completely come off because it doesn't have the kind of strength of the original, whereas there was real-world problems of a really high order that the film was confronting. Here it's more of the creator's pet peeves about where the society looks to be going. It's not really the same message as Dawn of the Dead, though it does share surface similarities. Dawn of the Dead used these themes to imbue a culture whereas we were overwhelmed, whereas here we feel sparse. The message continues to float and evolve, but never settles on any particular meaning. It's more like a meditation rather than a message, and there's nothing wrong with all that. But by the end of the film, you're not left as shaken, disturbed, and quietly informed like we were by the original film. And that's a thing of beauty in its own right, because this is a singular vision. But it doesn't even come close to the original film. Not in story, not in character, and certainly not in meaning. That said, there would never be another Texas Chainsaw film on this level. From here on out, we have some pretty empty exercises, some interesting experiments, and some outright failures. But these two films, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2, were both films that tried to elevate the genre in their own way. And whether you love this film, like this film, or dislike this film, there's no denying that it is a film that tried to say something. Whether that thought was successfully conveyed, or should have been conveyed, is not for me to say. Does it work for you? That's all that matters. And, oh yeah, there is something to be pointed out to the fact that the film itself was made as a completely cynical consumer product that attacks exactly what it is. That kind of brilliant hypocrisy was intentional. And it's something that filmmakers today could probably learn from. I'd love to know what you think of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, so please, leave a comment below.